At 72, my son called me a burden before abandoning me at an abandoned bus station 120 miles from home. He looked at me and sneered, "You're nothing but a useless old man now. Get out and figure out your own life." I froze as he drove away, leaving me alone with nowhere to turn. That night, I slept behind a trash can. I never returned home, until 2 years later when I stepped out of a luxury car at my son's child's first birthday party. Thank you for tuning in to Dad's Revenge Stories. To help build our community, leave a comment with your city or country. Please note, this story includes creative adjustments for dramatic and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual persons or settings is coincidental, but the message shared offers valuable insight. I want to tell you something about my hands before I tell you anything else. Look at them long enough, and you can read the whole story. The cracked knuckles from winters spent laying block in temperatures that turned mortar stiff before you could spread it. The pale scar running from my left thumb to my wrist from a framing nail that jumped a beam in 1987. The permanent gray shadow under my fingernails that no amount of soap ever fully reached. Eleanor used to hold my hands at the dinner table the way other women hold fine china carefully, like she understood their value. She would trace the calluses with her thumb and say, "Tommy, these hands built us a life." And she meant it as the highest compliment a person could pay another person. I am 74 years old. For 45 of those years, I was a builder. Not a developer, not an executive. A builder, the kind who shows up before sunrise, reads a set of blueprints, the way other men read the morning paper, and stays until the last nail is driven and the last corner is squared. I built houses in Hartford, Connecticut, when Hartford was still a city that believed in houses. I built schools in Bridgeport and a community center in New Haven that is still standing still, full of children on Tuesday afternoons. I built things meant to last, because that was the only way I knew how to build anything. My father taught me the trade the summer I turned 16, out on a job site in East Hartford, where the foreman called him Big Ray, and the other men made way when he walked the scaffolding. He handed me a framing hammer on my first morning and said, "The hammer doesn't care who's holding it. You earn your reputation one nail at a time." I drove 230 nails that day. I counted every one. I have been counting ever since. Eleanor passed in the spring of 2003 when Michael was 19, and still figuring out what kind of man he wanted to become. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that introduces itself and doesn't wait long to make its point. She was gone in 4 months. I held her hand through the last night and drove home in the gray morning light and sat in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. Because I knew that when I walked through that door, I would have to figure out how to be a father and a builder without the person who made both of those things make sense. Michael was a sharp kid, always had been. He got Eleanor's quickness with numbers and my stubbornness, which is a combination that can take a person very far in one direction or very far in the other. I worked double shifts for 3 years to keep him in good schools. I drove him to SAT prep on Saturday mornings and ate vending machine sandwiches in the parking lot while he was inside because I didn't want him to see me check my wallet twice before buying a cup of coffee. He got a scholarship to UConn, business administration. I shook his hand at his graduation with so much pride in my chest. I thought something might crack. He married Jennifer Caldwell in 2015. She was polished in the way that certain people are polished, smooth surfaces, careful angles, nothing left to catch the light wrong. I told myself on their wedding day that the tightness I felt in my chest was just emotion. A father watching his son start a life. Normal, expected. The first sign came 8 months after the wedding. At a dinner Michael hosted for a group of real estate investors he was trying to impress. He called me the week before and asked me to come. "Come meet these guys, Dad," he said, and his voice had the warmth in it that I had learned to hold on to because it was becoming less frequent. "They'd love to meet you." I wore the blazer Eleanor had picked out for me years ago. The dark gray one, she said, made me look distinguished. I brought a bottle of decent whiskey because I knew nothing about wine and refused to pretend otherwise. When I walked into Michael's penthouse on the 22nd floor, Jennifer met me at the door with a smile that stopped exactly at her cheekbones and took the whiskey from my hands without looking at the label. The investors were the kind of men who wore their watches like a second job. They talked about yield and portfolio density, and Michael kept pace with them without breaking a sweat. I sat at the corner of the table and listened and answered questions when they came my way, which was not often. Then one of the men, a fellow named Preston with cufflinks the size of coat buttons, asked what I did for work. "I'm in construction," I said. "Built most of my career in Hartford, commercial and residential." Preston nodded, the way people nod when they're already thinking about what they're going to say next. "Interesting," he said, and turned back to Michael. I looked down at my hands resting on the white tablecloth. The calluses, the scar, the shadow under the nails that no soap ever reached. And I watched Jennifer across the table glance at my hands, and then glance at Preston, and then reach over and move the bread basket so that it sat between my hands and the centerpiece like a small, elegant wall. I noticed. I said nothing. I was raised to believe that a man's work was his dignity, and that dignity was not something you defended at a dinner table with other people's silverware in your hands. I finished my meal. I shook hands at the door. I drove home on I-91 with the radio off and Eleanor's voice somewhere in the back of my mind. "Don't ever let anyone make you hide them, Tommy." After the guests left, Michael walked me to the elevator and put his hand on my shoulder. The gesture was familiar and strange at the same time, the way a house feels when you walk through it after a long time away. "Dad," he said, "these are really important relationships for me right now. The image stuff matters to these people." He paused and I watched him choose his next words, the way a man chooses which wire to cut. "Maybe next time a different jacket. Something a little more." He stopped. I looked at my son. He had Eleanor's eyes. He had my jawline. He had $212,000 in business school debt that I had co-signed without blinking, and he was standing in a $4,500 suit asking me to wear a different jacket. "Sure, Michael," I said. "Whatever helps." The elevator doors closed. I rode down 22 floors and walked out into the Hartford night and told myself it was stress. Told myself it was pressure. Told myself that young men building something from nothing sometimes lost their footing and needed time to find it again. I was wrong. It wasn't stress. It wasn't pressure. It was the beginning of something Michael had already decided, and I was the last one in the room to understand it. There is a particular kind of cruelty that never raises its voice. It does not slam doors or throw dishes or say the ugly thing out loud where witnesses can hear it. It works quietly in the space between what is said and what is meant, in the half-second pause before a smile arrives, in the way a person's eyes move to the room before they move back to you. Jennifer Walker, born Jennifer Caldwell, raised in Glastonbury, Connecticut, where the lawns are level and the gutters are always clean, had mastered this kind of cruelty the way some people master a second language, fluently, without accent, without effort. After that dinner party, I started paying a different kind of attention. I noticed that when Michael mentioned me to his colleagues, my profession had developed a habit of disappearing. He was from Hartford now, not from a family of builders. His father had been in real estate adjacent work, a phrase I heard him use at a charity golf event I attended at his invitation, standing near enough to catch it, but far enough that correcting him in front of those men would have cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. I did not correct him. I drove home wondering when Hartford became something to be from, rather than something to be proud of. The summer of 2019, Jennifer became pregnant with Liam. I found out through a text message a photograph of an ultrasound with 3 exclamation points and no other words. I sent back my congratulations and asked when would be a good time to call and talk. The answer came 4 days later. "We're really slammed right now, Thomas. We'll set something up soon." She had started calling me Thomas around the time Michael made his first million. Before that, it had been Dad. I told myself it was hormones, pregnancy stress, rich people problems. I told myself a lot of things in those years that I no longer believe. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, sitting across from a young man named Marcus Reed in a small office that smelled like sawdust and black coffee, was that 6 months before the night Michael drove me 120 miles from home, Jennifer had done something at a dinner party of her own. I was not invited to this dinner. I was in a sense the entertainment. She had taken a photograph of my hands. I had been sitting at their dining table during one of the rare Sunday visits that still happened in those days, and she had positioned herself across from me with her phone in her lap, and she had taken a photograph of my hands resting on the white tablecloth. The calluses, the scarring, the permanent shadow that 45 years of honest work had pressed into my skin. She had sent that photograph to a group chat of her friends and social circle with a caption I will not repeat here, because the words belong to her and she is welcome to keep them. One of the women in that group chat was named Diana. Diana's husband at the time was a 28-year-old man with a criminal record and no prospects, sitting in a vocational training center in Hartford, trying to figure out if the world had any use for him. His name was Marcus Reed, and Diana showed Marcus that photograph. But I am getting ahead of myself. In the fall of 2021, I still did not know any of this. What I knew was the dinner table. What I knew was Jennifer's hand reaching across to adjust the centerpiece, angling the flower arrangement so that it stood between my hands and the sightlines of whatever guest had come that evening. What I knew was Michael's voice on the phone growing shorter, the visits growing less frequent, the invitations arriving later and later until they stopped arriving at all. The last Sunday visit happened in March of 2022. I brought a coffee cake from the bakery on Farmington Avenue that Eleanor had loved, the kind with the brown sugar crumble on top that takes 20 minutes to make properly and means something when you carry it through someone's door. Jennifer accepted it with both hands, and a smile that her eyes refused to join set it on the kitchen counter and turned back to the conversation she had been having with Michael about a rooftop terrace renovation for their Simsbury investment property. I sat at their kitchen island and drank coffee that had gone cold and listened to them talk about square footage and resale value and landscaping contractors. At one point, Jennifer turned to me and said with the brightness of someone who has just remembered a pet in another room, "Thomas, you used to do some of that work, didn't you? Construction-type things, used to." Construction-type things. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, those hands that had framed the load-bearing walls of 214 residential structures that had poured the foundation of a school where 1,200 children learned to read, that had carried Eleanor to bed on the nights her legs gave out in her final weeks, and I said, "Yes, Jennifer, some of that." Michael was looking at his laptop. He did not look up. I drove home on I-84 that afternoon, with the windows down despite the cold, because I needed the air moving. I stopped at a red light on New Britain Avenue and looked at my hands on the steering wheel and had a conversation with Eleanor that I have had many times since she left, the kind that happens in your chest, rather than out loud. "She's ashamed of me," I told her. "And Michael is letting her be." The light turned green. I drove. 3 weeks after that Sunday, Michael called on a Tuesday evening. His voice had the careful quality of someone reading from a script they have memorized, but not yet performed. He said he had been thinking, and that it might be good for me to get out of Hartford for a while, clear my head, maybe visit the old neighborhood where I grew up. He said he knew how much I missed the pace of things outside the city. He said he wanted to take me himself, make a day of it, father and son. He said it like a gift. He had rehearsed it to sound like a gift. I said yes. Because he was my son, and I loved him, and love makes you say yes to things your instincts know better than to accept. That is the part they do not tell you about being a parent. The love does not protect you. Sometimes the love is exactly what they are counting on. The morning Michael came to pick me up, I made 2 cups of coffee. Old habit. 40 years of making 2 cups every morning, because Eleanor took hers with 1 sugar and just enough cream to turn it the color of caramel, and some habits do not ask your permission before they outlive the person who made them necessary. I stood in my kitchen on Arbor Street and looked at the 2nd cup steaming on the counter, and then I poured it down the drain and carried mine to the window. It was the 14th of November, a Tuesday. The kind of Hartford morning that smells like wood smoke and wet pavement, where the sky sits low and gray like a ceiling that needs replacing. I had packed a small bag the night before, 3 days of clothes, my blood pressure medication, the paperback I had been working through for 2 weeks. Michael had said a few days, maybe a week. Fresh air, he said. A change of scenery. You work too hard, Dad. You deserve a rest. He arrived at 8:45 in a silver Audi I did not recognize. New lease, probably. He was always in a new lease. He came to the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and a smile that sat slightly too high on his face, the way a picture hangs when it has been straightened too many times. "Ready?" he said. I picked up my bag and followed him out. For the first hour, it was almost good. Michael talked about the business, a mixed-use development he was pursuing in Glastonbury, a zoning variance he was waiting on a contractor who had missed 3 deadlines and was about to find out what missing a 4th one cost. I listened and asked questions, and he answered them with the energy of a man who is comfortable talking about himself, which he always had been. And for a while, I let myself believe that this was just a drive. Just a father and a son on a November morning with an hour to fill. We passed the Meriden interchange, and the conversation began to thin. Michael turned the radio on low, some station playing songs I did not recognize, and his answers to my questions grew shorter, more clipped, like a man rationing something he was running low on. I watched the exits pass. Middletown, Portland, the river on our left going dark under the November sky. I did not recognize this route. I told myself that was because I did not know every road in Connecticut. I told myself a lot of things on that drive that I am no longer willing to repeat. Somewhere past Cobalt, Michael stopped talking entirely. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have said enough. The other kind, the kind with weight in it, the kind that arrives when someone is managing the distance between where they are and what they are about to do. I watched the back of his neck. I have always read my son the way I read a job site looking for the thing that is not right. The beam that is slightly off, plumb the foundation that has settled wrong. His neck was rigid. His knuckles on the steering wheel were pale. "Michael," I said. "Where are we going?" "Almost there," he said. He did not look at me. The bus stop appeared out of the dark, like something that had been waiting. A covered shelter on a county road outside a town called Haddam, 40 miles past anything I would have called a destination. No lights inside the shelter, no schedules posted. The kind of structure that gets built because someone applies for a grant and then forgotten because no buses actually stop there anymore. Michael pulled off the road and cut the engine. My chest did something I do not have a clean word for. Not fear exactly. Something older and simpler than fear. Recognition. Michael got out. I got out. He went to the trunk and lifted it and pulled out my bag. The bag I had packed myself the night before with 3 days of clothes and my blood pressure medication, and set it on the ground beside the shelter with a care that was somehow worse than roughness would have been. Then he straightened up and looked at me, and his face had the expression of a man who has rehearsed a moment so many times that the rehearsal has replaced the feeling. "Shh, Dad," he said. His voice was level, controlled. "Jennifer and I have talked about this a lot. You understand that, right? This isn't something I decided overnight." My throat tightened around whatever I was going to say and held it there. I looked at my son standing in the dark beside a road I did not know with my bag at his feet, and I understood with a completeness that left no room for argument that the weekend getaway had never existed. There was no vacation. There was no old neighborhood. There was no fresh air. There was this road, this shelter, this moment he had been building toward since at least March. "You're leaving me here," I said. It was not a question. Michael looked at the shelter and then back at me, and his jaw tightened with the particular tension of a man who has rehearsed this moment long enough that the rehearsal has replaced the feeling. "Dad," he said, "Jennifer and I have talked about this for a long time. You're a burden. I don't know how else to say it. The business, the image, the people we need to be around you don't fit. You never did." His voice dropped, and what came out next was not rehearsed. It was the thing underneath the rehearsal, the part he had been carrying long enough that it had grown teeth. "You're just a useless old man now. I'm done taking care of you. Get out and survive on your own." He reached into his jacket and held out a fold of bills. "You always told me a man has to stand on his own 2 feet. I'm just applying the lesson." He reached into his jacket and held out a fold of bills. I did not take it. He set it on top of my bag. "There's a gas station about 2 miles east," he said. "You can call someone from there." He got back in the Audi. The engine turned over with that quiet, expensive sound that new cars make, the sound of something that costs more than it should. The headlights came on and swept across the shelter and across me, and then the car pulled back onto the road and accelerated into the dark. And I watched the taillights shrink and disappear around a bend in the county road. And then there was nothing but the wind moving through the bare trees and the sound of my own breathing, and the bag at my feet with $47 sitting on top of it. The temperature was 26 degrees. I know that because I checked my watch before I realized my watch was the only thing I had with a screen and no signal. I picked up the $47. I picked up my bag. I sat down inside the shelter and looked at the road where my son's car had been. Then I opened my bag to take stock of what I had. And at the very bottom, beneath the folded clothes and the medication and the paperback, my fingers found something I had not packed. It was my notebook. Not a journal, not a diary. Nothing so personal as that. It was a 9 by 12 spiral-bound notebook, the kind you buy in bulk at a hardware store, with a green cover so worn at the corners that the cardboard showed through like bone through skin. I had been keeping it since 1978, 44 years of accumulated knowledge written in the cramped, precise hand of a man who learned early that the difference between a good build and a failed one often came down to what you remembered versus what you assumed. Inside were load calculations for soil types I had encountered across 30 years of Hartford foundations. Mortar mix ratios adjusted for Connecticut winters, annotated with the exact temperatures at which each formula began to fail. Pencil sketches of joinery solutions I had invented on job sites when the standard approach would not hold. Notes from every master builder I had ever worked alongside, their names written at the top of each page like dedications. There were pages stained with coffee, and pages stained with rain, and one page in the back where Eleanor had written a grocery list in 1994, and I had never had the heart to tear it out. Michael had gone through my apartment before that drive. I understood that now, sitting in the shelter with the notebook in my hands, and the 47 degrees of November pressing through the gaps in the aluminum walls. He had taken my wallet. He had taken my phone. He had left the blood pressure medication, I will give him that much, and he had left the paperback, and he had left this notebook, because he had held it in his hands and turned it over and seen nothing in it worth keeping. That judgment told me everything about the distance between what my son valued and what actually had value. I put the notebook in my inside jacket pocket against my chest, and I got up and walked the perimeter of the shelter the way I have always walked an unfamiliar structure, methodically looking for what holds and what does not. The shelter was maybe 8 feet by 6, 3 walls of corrugated aluminum, a roof with a rusted seam along the center ridge that would leak in rain but was holding tonight. The open face looked east, which meant the wind came from behind it. That was something. Behind the shelter, between the back wall and a stand of bare oaks, someone had left a stack of broken-down cardboard boxes. Delivery boxes, from the look of them, collapsed flat and leaned against the aluminum. A gift from no one in particular, the way good fortune sometimes arrives, not because the universe is kind, but because enough people have passed through enough hard places that they leave things behind without meaning to. Behind the shelter, pushed against the east wall, was a large commercial trash can, the green plastic kind, that municipalities bolt to concrete pads and forget about. It was positioned exactly where the wind broke around the corner of the aluminum wall, creating a pocket of still air no larger than a man sitting with his knees pulled up. I pulled 2 pieces of flattened cardboard flat on the ground behind it out of the wind with a narrow line of sight to the road between the trash can and the tree line. Then I sat down on the cardboard with my back against the cold plastic and my jacket zipped to my chin, and understood that I was spending the night behind a trash can on a county road in Connecticut at 72 years old because my son had decided I was a burden and had acted accordingly. What I had, $47 in mixed bills, 3 days of clothing, blood pressure medication enough for 2 weeks, 1 worn paperback, 1 notebook containing 44 years of professional knowledge, 1 watch. The jacket on my back, which was a good one wool blend, bought the winter before warm enough for temperatures down to about 20 degrees if you kept moving. What I did not have: a phone, identification, a clear sense of what came next. What I did have, which does not appear on any inventory list, but which I have carried since I was 16 years old, standing on a scaffold in East Hartford, watching my father read a set of blueprints in the wind, the understanding that a foundation is only as good as the ground it sits on, and that the first job always, in every situation, is to understand the ground. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees around midnight. I know because my joints told me the way they have told me the temperature every winter since I turned 50, a biological thermometer I did not ask for and cannot return. I pulled my knees up inside my jacket and thought about Eleanor. Not with grief, I was past the sharp grief by then, 9 years out from losing her. With something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, that she was not alive to know about this night. That she did not have to sit somewhere warm and understand what her son had done with the man she loved. Around 2 in the morning, headlights appeared on the county road. A vehicle moving slowly, much slower than the road, required the way a car moves when the driver is looking for something, rather than going somewhere. It came from the west, from the direction Michael's car had gone, and it rolled past the shelter at a speed that made my chest tighten with a sudden, violent hope that I had not expected to feel. The headlights swept across the tree line, across the shelter. I raised my hand, a reflex the way you raised your hand at something you need, but the vehicle did not slow further. It continued east, and its taillights shrank in the dark, two red points growing smaller until the bend in the road took them, and then there was nothing. I sat with my hand still raised for a moment. Then I lowered it. I did not know whose car that was. I would not know for 2 more years. What I knew in that moment was the specific weight of a hope that arrives and departs in the same breath, and I filed it away in the part of myself that stores things I cannot yet explain and may need later. The cardboard held my body heat better than I had expected. I slept in intervals 40 minutes, then awake, then 30 minutes. Then awake the way I have always slept on job sites when a pour needed monitoring. At 6 in the morning, the sky went from black to the particular gray-purple of a New England dawn, and I stood up and stretched my back against the shelter wall and took 3 of my blood pressure pills with a handful of dew off the oak leaves because that was what was available. Then I picked up my bag, put the notebook back against my chest, and walked east toward the gas station my son had mentioned. 2 miles. I counted my steps the way I once counted nails. It gave the walking a purpose. I had gone perhaps a quarter mile when I heard a truck slow behind me, and a window come down, and a voice say, with the careful uncertainty of a man who cannot quite believe what he is seeing, "Sir, excuse me. Sir, is that Thomas Walker?" I turned around slowly the way you turn when you are not entirely sure the voice is real. The truck was a Ford F-250, maybe 10 years old, with a ladder rack across the bed, and Hartford County mud on the wheel wells the truck of a man who works for a living and does not apologize for it. The window was down, and the driver was leaning across the passenger seat, squinting at me through the early light, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked very much like relief. He was in his early 50s. Dark work jacket company logo on the chest I could not read from where I stood. A face that had spent considerable time outdoors, weathered at the temples, calm around the eyes the way faces get when they have absorbed enough hard weather to stop being surprised by it. "Robert," I said. He was out of the truck before I finished saying his name. Robert Hayes had been 22 years old the summer I taught him to set a foundation on a job site in Wethersfield. It was 1992, and he was the youngest man on my crew, and the most frightened, though he worked hard not to show it. He had a habit of measuring twice and then measuring a third time because he was afraid of what I would say if the numbers were wrong. I had taken him aside on the third day and told him that a man who is afraid to make a mistake will spend his whole life making the small ones because he never risks the large ones. He had looked at me with the particular expression of a young person receiving information they do not yet have the experience to fully use, and he had nodded. And by the end of that summer, he was the most precise worker on my crew. 30 years. He had filled out through the shoulders, and his hair had gone mostly gray, but he had the same way of standing weight forward, hands ready, like a man always half a second from being useful. He grabbed my bag before I could protest. "Mr. Walker." His voice broke slightly on the second word, and he cleared his throat hard. "What in the how long have you been out here?" "Since last night," I said. The way his face moved through what I had just told him, the math of it, the implications reminded me of watching a building settle. A series of small adjustments, each one changing the load on the next. "Get in the truck," he said. It was not a request. The heat inside the cab hit me like walking through a door I had forgotten existed. Robert cranked it higher without asking and pulled back onto the county road heading west. He did not ask me immediately what had happened. He drove for about 4 minutes while the heater worked, and my hands stopped aching. And then he said, "Was it Michael?" I looked out the passenger window at the Connecticut morning frost on the field grass. A barn in the distance with a gambrel roof I would have built differently. "Yes," I said. Robert's jaw tightened. His right hand gripped the wheel once hard, then released. "Okay," he said. Just that. The single syllable of a man who has decided something without needing to announce it. He drove me to a white clapboard church on Route 9 outside Middletown, the kind of New England church that has been repaired so many times it has become a record of every generation that needed it. The sign out front read, Shepherd's Crossing Community Church, and below that on the changeable letterboard, someone had put, Every foundation begins with one true thing. I stared at that sign for a moment longer than made sense. Pastor Eugene Whitfield met us at the side door. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had done physical work earlier in life and carried the posture of it still broad through the chest. Deliberate in his movements, with large hands that wrapped around mine when he shook it and held on one beat longer than a formal greeting required. His eyes were the particular shade of brown that holds light rather than reflecting it. He looked at me the way very few people had looked at me in recent years, directly, without calculation, without the preliminary scan that checks your clothes and your shoes before it checks your face. Eugene Whitfield, he said. Most people call me Pastor Gene. Come inside, Mr. Walker. Robert called ahead. The room he took me to was small, a study behind the sanctuary, with 2 armchairs and a wood stove that was already burning, and a shelf of books that had been read rather than displayed. He brought coffee without asking, and set it on the table between the chairs, and sat down across from me, and waited. Not the performative waiting of someone demonstrating patience. The real kind, the kind that has no agenda behind it. I told him the shape of it. Not everything, not yet. The drive, the shelter, the $47, the night. He listened with his elbows on his knees and his coffee forgotten in his right hand. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment with the quiet of a man processing weight. "How are your hands?" he asked. I looked down at them. Stiff from the cold, the knuckles swollen slightly, the way they got every winter now. "They work," I said. Good." He nodded once. "Then you still have your most important tools." He offered me the room behind the study, a small space with a cot and a window that looked out on the church's side garden, dormant now in November, but with the structure of something that bloomed well in the right season. Clean sheets, a working radiator, a hook on the back of the door. That night, after Robert had gone home and the church was quiet, Pastor Gene knocked on the door and came in and sat in the single chair by the window. He had something on his mind. I could see it in the way he held his coffee, both hands, elbows on his knees, the posture of a man carrying something he has decided to set down. "Last night," he said carefully. "Around 2 in the morning. I was up, I keep odd hours, always have. I was in the sanctuary, and I looked out the east window." He paused. There was a car on the county road, moving very slowly past the shelter, slower than the road required. My chest went still. "When it stopped," he said, or nearly stopped. Sat there maybe 20 minutes in the dark with the engine running. Then it pulled back onto the road and went east. He looked at me steadily. The person in the passenger seat was a woman. I could see that much from the window. She was looking toward the shelter the whole time. I stared at the wood stove. The fire inside it shifted and resettled. I don't know whose car it was," Pastor Gene said quietly. "I don't know if it matters." He stood and picked up his coffee. "I just thought you should know that someone came back, even if they didn't come far enough." He said night and closed the door. I sat on the cot in the small warm room and pressed my hand flat against the notebook in my jacket pocket and thought about a woman sitting in a dark car 20 minutes from a bus shelter, looking at the dark and choosing the road home. I did not sleep again that night, but I was warm. And in the morning, there would be work to do. Robert picked me up at 7 the next morning and drove me to a building on Flatbush Avenue in Hartford that had been losing the argument with time for about 15 years. Hayes Vocational Center. 3 stories of load-bearing masonry construction built in the mid-70s when Hartford still believed it had an industrial future. The brick was good Chicago common, the kind that was fired hotter and longer than modern brick and would outlast anything built in the last 30 years if someone bothered to repoint the mortar joints, which no one had. The windows on the second floor had been replaced with the wrong size frames, leaving gaps that had been filled with expanding foam insulation that had since yellowed and shrunk away from the edges. The front entrance had a concrete step that had heaved and cracked from frost damage, a fixable problem that had been left unfixed long enough to become a liability. A sign above the door read, Hayes Vocational Center Building Futures, with the word Futures hanging at an angle because one of its mounting screws had pulled free from the brick. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building for a long time without speaking. Robert stood beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets. I know how it looks, he said. It looks like a building that gave up because nobody asked it not to, I said. That's a different problem than a building that can't be saved. He took me inside. The ground floor had 4 classrooms and a workshop space with a concrete floor that had been poured badly too thin in the center aggregate, showing through in 3 places where foot traffic had ground it down. The electrical panel in the utility room was a Federal Pacific stab lock, a brand discontinued in the 1980s after studies showed a significant failure rate in the circuit breakers, meaning it tripped inconsistently and, more dangerously, sometimes did not trip at all. I made a note in my notebook the moment I saw it. The Federal Pacific panel had to go before anything else happened in this building. That was not a renovation decision. That was a safety decision. The second floor housed Robert's administrative office and 2 additional classrooms, one of which had a ceiling stain the size of a dining table from a roof leak that had been patched but not solved. The third floor was unused, locked, and smelled like a room that had been making its own weather for several years. How many students right now? I asked. 11, Robert said. He said it the way a man says a number he is ashamed of when the number used to be much larger. We had 32 2 years ago. The funding dried up. Word got around that we might close. People stopped enrolling. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've got maybe 4 months before the bank calls the note on the building. $180,000. I walked to the workshop window and looked out at the parking lot below, cracked asphalt, 2 cars, a dumpster that needed emptying. Then I looked back at the workshop space. Good ceiling height, adequate natural light from the south-facing windows, concrete floor that could be ground down and resurfaced for less than $3,000 if you did the labor yourself, which I intended to. Robert, I said, do you remember the summer of 1992 when you asked me why I bothered teaching the crew instead of just telling them what to do? He smiled at the window. You said a crew that understands the reason does better work than a crew that just follows orders. That's still true. I turned from the window. Don't close this place. Let me fix the building and redesign the curriculum. I'll work for room and board while the church lets me stay. We'll have this place running properly inside of 90 days. Robert turned to face me fully. His expression had the particular quality of a man who wants to say yes and is fighting his own decency about letting someone give him something. Mr. Walker, he said, I cannot let you work for nothing. Not after what you've not after last night. You stopped your truck on a county road at 6 in the morning for an old man sitting in the cold, I said. You didn't ask for my resume first. You didn't calculate what it was worth to you. You just stopped. I held his gaze. That is the curriculum I want to teach in this building. Let me teach it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put out his hand. I shook it. No contract. No attorney. The kind of agreement that holds, because both people understand that their word is the only collateral that matters. The first 30 days were the hardest and the best. I rose at 5:30 every morning, ate breakfast with Pastor Jean, and was at the building by 7. I started with the electrical panel, hired a licensed electrician named Dave Kowalski to replace the Federal Pacific unit with a modern square D panel, while I worked alongside him, learning the current code requirements and updating my notebook accordingly. The panel replacement cost $4,200, which Robert paid from the last of his operating reserve. It was the right thing to spend the last of anything on, then the concrete floor. I rented a planetary grinder from a tool supply house on Weathersfield Avenue and spent 4 days on my knees working the surface down to clean aggregate, then applied a 2-part epoxy coating that would hold foot traffic for 20 years if maintained properly. The 11 students watched me work. On the 3rd day, 2 of them asked if they could help. On the 4th day, all 11 were on the floor with me. I rewrote the curriculum from the notebook. Not copying it page by page, but translating it the way you translate a language you have spoken for 40 years into words a 20-year-old can use immediately. Load-bearing versus non-load-bearing walls. How to read a soil report. Why a foundation that is built correctly the first time costs less than one that is built quickly the second time. Practical things. True things. By the end of the first month, Robert had 3 new enrollment inquiries. By the end of the second, he had 9. The word that was getting around now was different from the word that had been getting around before. One afternoon in the 3rd week, I was repointing the mortar joints on the front facade, a trowel and hawk, the oldest tool combination in masonry, when I became aware that someone had stopped on the sidewalk behind me and was watching. I turned around. He was young, late 20s, a scar above his left eyebrow, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be careful about how much space he takes up in a room. He was watching my hands on the trowel with an expression I recognized: hunger, but not for food, for the kind of competence that makes the world make sense. "You're good at that," he said. 45 years, I said. "It gets easier." He looked at the building, then at me. "They say you used to be somebody." I set the trowel on the hawk and looked at him directly. "I still am," I said. "So are you. You just don't know it yet." He considered that for a moment with the seriousness of someone who does not spend consideration cheaply. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said. I picked up my trowel. "I know who you are, Marcus. Robert told me about you. Come back tomorrow morning at 7 and bring work boots." I turned back to the wall. "And Marcus, be on time. We start without you either way." Marcus Reed showed up the next morning at 6:58. He was wearing steel-toed boots that were 2 sizes too large and laced unevenly, the kind of boots a man buys at a Goodwill on a Tuesday because he needs them by Wednesday and does not have the luxury of waiting for the right fit. He stood in the workshop doorway with his hands at his sides and his chin level, not quite looking at me, and not quite looking away, the posture of someone who has been turned away from enough doors that he has developed a system for absorbing rejection before it arrives. I handed him a broom. "Start with the corners," I said. "A clean floor tells you what the room actually is. Dust hides everything." He swept without complaint. When he finished, he came back and stood in front of me and waited. I handed him a level. That was how it began. Marcus Reed had grown up in the Bellevue Square housing projects on the north end of Hartford, the 3rd of 4 children. Raised by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who had not been consistently present since Marcus was 9 years old. He had been bright in school. His 3rd grade teacher had written on a report card that he had Exceptional spatial reasoning. A phrase his mother had kept, but bright and unsupervised in Bellevue Square in the late 1990s was a combination that the neighborhood was more likely to use than to protect. He had caught a receiving stolen property charge at 24, spent 18 months in Cheshire Correctional, and come out to find that the job market had the memory of an elephant and the mercy of a landlord on the first of the month. He had been at Hayes Vocational Center for 3 weeks before I arrived, attending irregularly, skeptical of everything, certain on some level that this too would be a place that offered something and then recalculated what it was willing to give. On his third day with me, I asked him to cut a piece of 2x4 to a specific length using a miter saw. He measured once, marked it, and then stood at the saw without cutting for nearly a full minute. "Something wrong with the blade?" I asked. "No." He kept his eyes on the mark. "I don't want to cut it wrong." I walked over and stood beside him. "Marcus, look at me." He did. "A wrong cut costs you one piece of lumber and 30 seconds. Hesitation costs you the whole job. Cut the board." He cut it. It was perfect. Within 1/32 of an inch, which for a first cut on a miter saw is as good as it gets. He looked at the cut end with an expression I had seen once before in a mirror the summer my father handed me a framing hammer, and I drove my first nail straight and true, and understood for the first time that my hands knew something my brain was still catching up to. "Do it again," I said. "Different length. Faster." By the end of that week, he was cutting to tolerance every time. By the end of the second week, he was teaching the method to the student beside him, without being asked, which told me everything I needed to know about what Marcus Reed was capable of when someone gave him a reason to believe the effort would count. He was not easy. I want to be honest about that. There were mornings he arrived late, smelling like a night that had not gone well, and I sent him home and docked the day from his attendance record, the same as I would have docked any other student, because treating a man differently than his peers is not kindness. It is a different kind of dismissal. There was one afternoon in February when he threw a hammer across the workshop after a measurement came out wrong 3 times in a row, and the hammer hit the wall 2 feet from where Robert was standing. And I walked across that floor and looked Marcus Reed in the eye from about 18 inches away and said in the voice I used for situations where volume would be a waste of energy, "You do that one more time and you're done here. Not because I don't believe in you. Because I do, and men I believe in do not throw tools." His chest was heaving. His hands were shaking at his sides, the particular tremor of a young man holding a very large feeling in a body that does not yet know where to put it. "I can't get it right," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked furious at himself for letting it. "Yes, you can," I said. "Pick up the hammer. Measure again, slower this time." He picked up the hammer. He measured again. He got it right. After that, something shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies where a single moment changes everything and the swelling music tells you so. The real kind of shift, which is quieter and takes longer and is more durable for both of those reasons. Marcus began arriving 10 minutes early. He started staying after the other students left, asking questions that went beyond the day's curriculum load path analysis. Soil-bearing capacity, the difference between a structural engineer's drawings and an architect's drawings, and why both mattered. He had a notebook of his own now, the same kind I used, bought from the same hardware store on Wethersfield Avenue. In April, he told me about Diana. They had met in community college, before his arrest. Lost each other during the 18 months he was in Cheshire, found each other again the month he got out, because Hartford is a small city, and some things are more persistent than the worst luck you can have. She worked at Hartford Hospital in the billing department. She was, Marcus said, the only person outside of his mother who had consistently believed that he was more than the worst thing he had ever done. "She sounds like someone worth being better for," I said. Marcus looked at the floor and then back at me. "She is," he said quietly. "She's the reason I came here." He paused. "She heard about this place from a woman in her, from a friend, and she told me to go." He stopped himself mid-sentence in a way that I noticed, but did not push on. There was something he was not yet ready to say. I had learned in 45 years of working alongside men that the things a person is not yet ready to say have a way of finding their moment without being forced. By June, Marcus had completed the full curriculum with the highest evaluation scores Robert had ever recorded. He could frame a wall, set a foundation, read a structural drawing, and calculate a load path without a calculator. He could also, I had noticed, do arithmetic in his head at a speed that had nothing to do with what I had taught him. And he was reading financial materials after hours, not textbooks. The real ones. The kind of dense industry publications that most people in construction never open, because the building side and the money side of the business are kept deliberately separate by the people who benefit from that separation. One evening in late June, he sat across from me in the small office that smelled like sawdust and black coffee and said 6 words that I had not seen coming. "Mr. Walker, I want to invest in you." I looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus," I said, "I'm 72 years old." "I know exactly how old you are," he said. He did not smile. "That's not what I asked." I looked at Marcus Reed across that small desk for a long moment and tried to find the joke in what he had just said. There was no joke. Marcus had the face of a man who had thought about this long enough that he was past the part where it felt uncertain. He reached into the canvas bag he carried everywhere and set a folder on the desk between us. Inside was a single printed page, a summary of his personal investment account accumulated over 3 years of careful saving while working night shifts at an Amazon distribution center in Windsor Locks after his release from Cheshire. The number at the bottom of the page was not large by the standards of the people Michael did business with. By the standards of a 29-year-old with a criminal record who had rebuilt himself from nothing, it was extraordinary. $41,000. "That's what I have," Marcus said. "I know it's not enough on its own, but I've been talking to 2 other investors, men I met through a small business development workshop at the Hartford Public Library. Between the 3 of us, we can put together $3.5 million. I sat back in my chair. The wood stove in the corner was ticking as it cooled, and outside the window, Flatbush Avenue was doing its early evening business. A delivery truck, double-parked 2 women talking outside the laundromat, a kid on a bicycle navigating the gap between them with the confidence of someone who has done it 1,000 times. "Marcus," I said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing to invest in?" "Walker Legacy Construction," he said. I had not named it yet. He had named it for me. "You," he continued, "and Robert and the graduates of this program. A construction company built on the curriculum in that notebook. We take contracts the big firms won't touch because the margins are too thin or the neighborhoods are too complicated. We do the work right. We build the reputation. Within 3 years, we are the firm that every municipal contract in Hartford wants to use because we are the only ones who consistently deliver." He paused. "I've run the numbers 4 times. It works." I looked at this young man, who 6 months ago had been unable to cut a board without freezing at the saw, and I understood something that does not translate easily into words, the particular feeling of watching a person become fully themselves. It is like watching a foundation settle into solid ground. You can see the moment it stops moving and starts holding. "There's something else," Marcus said. His voice changed register slightly lower, more careful. He reached into the canvas bag again and set his phone on the desk, face up. On the screen was a photograph. I recognized my own hands. The photograph had been taken from below table level, at an angle that caught the overhead light falling across the knuckles. The scar from the framing nail, the gray shadow under the fingernails that no amount of soap had ever reached. It was a precise photograph, deliberate. The kind that requires a moment of decision before you take it. I picked up the phone. My chest was doing something I had no clean name for, not anger exactly, not hurt exactly, but the specific feeling of having a private thing made into a public object without your knowledge or permission. "Where did this come from?" I asked. My voice came out level. I was grateful for that. "Diana," Marcus said. "She received it in a group chat." He watched my face carefully. "About 8 months ago, from a contact saved as Jenny W. Jenny W. Jennifer Walker, born Jennifer Caldwell. Raised in Glastonbury, Connecticut, where the lawns were level and the gutters were always clean." "The caption," I asked. Marcus pressed his lips together. "I'd rather not repeat it, Mr. Walker. It was not kind." He picked up the phone and turned the screen face down on the desk. "Diana almost didn't tell me. She said she was afraid it would hurt you, but I told her you were the kind of man who needed to know the full foundation before you could build on it." He looked at me steadily. "That's what you taught me." I stood up and walked to the window. The delivery truck had found a parking spot. The 2 women outside the laundromat had gone inside. The kid on the bicycle was gone. Flatbush Avenue was just an avenue, now ordinary and indifferent the way streets are when you need them to be something more. Eleanor's voice arrived the way it always did not. As a sound, but as a certainty, the way you know the temperature of a room the moment you walk into it. "Don't ever let anyone make you hide them, Tommy." I pressed my right hand flat against the window glass. The cold came through immediately, the November cold still living in the walls of this building, the way cold always lives in Hartford walls. I held my hand there until the feeling passed through me and out the other side. Then I turned around. "Diana showed you this 8 months ago," I said, "and you waited until now to tell me." "I wanted to earn the right to tell you," Marcus said simply. "I didn't want to come to you with bad news about your family until I could also come to you with something worth building toward." His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the desk. The hands of a man who has learned what his hands are for. "I'm not asking you to be angry, Mr. Walker. I'm asking you to build something so large that the photograph becomes irrelevant. Something so permanent that nobody who ever looked at your hands sideways can pretend they didn't see exactly what those hands were capable of." I looked at Marcus Reed for a long time. I thought about Jennifer Caldwell sitting at my son's dinner table with her phone in her lap, framing the shot. I thought about a group chat notification arriving on Diana Reed's phone, and Diana staring at the screen and making the decision to tell her husband, and Marcus carrying that information for 8 months, while he learned to cut a board and frame a wall and calculate a load path, waiting until he had something to offer alongside the wound. I thought about a notebook sitting against my chest on a November night behind a trash can on a county road in Haddam, and a son who had left it behind because he could not read what was written in it. 3.5 million, I said. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. I looked at my hands. The calluses, the scar, the shadow under the nails. Then I looked at Marcus Reed, 29 years old, sitting across from me with $41,000 and 3 years of night shifts and a moral vocabulary that shamed men twice his age. "All right, Marcus," I said. "Let's build something." Walker Legacy Construction was incorporated in the state of Connecticut on the 17th of July, 2023. The paperwork took 11 days and cost $450 in filing fees, which Marcus paid from his personal account, and recorded in a spreadsheet with the precision of a man who understands that every dollar in the early life of a company is a decision, not an expense. We registered as a limited liability company, an LLC structure that separated the company's legal obligations from our personal assets, meaning that if a contract went wrong or a subcontractor filed a dispute, our personal savings and property were protected from the liability. Marcus had researched this thoroughly. He presented the structure to Robert and me at the kitchen table of the church annex one Sunday morning, with a printed summary and 3 highlighters in different colors. And I remember thinking that this young man was going to be formidable at whatever he turned his attention to next. We opened a business account at Dime Bank on New Britain Avenue with the initial investment capital. Marcus's $41,000 went in first. He insisted on that, said he wanted his money in the ground before anyone else's, the way a good foundation man sets the cornerstones before he runs the line. The remaining $3.45 million followed within the week as the other investors transferred their commitments. I stood at the bank counter watching the balance on the screen and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not excitement exactly, but the particular steadiness of a man who has found the ground under his feet again after a period of not being sure it was there. Our first office was a room above the workshop at Hayes Vocational Center. Robert gave it to us for $200 a month, which was less than it was worth and more than we could comfortably afford, and we shook hands on it the same way we had shaken hands on everything since November, without paperwork, on the strength of what we had already proven to each other. The first 3 contracts were small: a foundation repair on Flatbush Avenue, a structural assessment and remediation on a triple-decker in the Frog Hollow neighborhood that had been flagged by the city building department for a compromised, load-bearing wall, a complete bathroom renovation for a Veterans Affairs transitional housing facility on Weathersfield Avenue, which came to us through a referral from Pastor Gene, who sat on the facilities advisory board. We completed all 3 on time, under budget, and without a single callback. In the construction business, no callbacks is the only metric that matters in the long run. Every other number can be adjusted. A callback is a crack in the foundation of your reputation, and cracks in foundations do not stay small. By September, the referrals had begun arriving without us chasing them. A property management company in Bloomfield, a school district in East Hartford with 3 buildings that needed structural evaluations before the state would release renovation funding, a developer in New Haven who had heard our name from the Veterans Affairs facility contact and wanted a conversation about a project that had stalled. The New Haven developer led us to Riverside Commons. The project had been in various stages of stalled for 4 years. 200 residential units in a mixed-income development on the eastern edge of New Haven, originally contracted to a mid-size regional firm that had run into financing trouble 18 months into the build and walked away from the site with the foundations poured, and the framing started on 40 of the 200 units. The site had been sitting since then, a field of concrete stems and half-built frames that the neighborhood had taken to calling the concrete graveyard, because that is what it looked like when you drove past it on a gray morning and the weeds had grown up through the slab penetrations, and the half-framed walls had begun to rack slightly from 2 winters without bracing. I walked the site on a Thursday morning in October with Marcus and Robert and a structural engineer named Patricia Osei that Marcus had found through the Connecticut chapter of the National Society of Professional Engineers. Patricia was 43 years old and had the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has spent 2 decades being right about things that matter. She walked every stem wall with a rebar locator and a crack gauge, made notes in her own battered field notebook, and at the end of 2 hours told us that the existing foundations were sound, poured correctly. The right mix design for the soil conditions, no significant settlement, and that the framing on the 40 started units could be salvaged with selective replacement of members that had weathered beyond tolerance. The bones are good, she said. Somebody did the underground work right before they ran out of money. I crouched down at the nearest stem wall and ran my hand along the top surface. Clean, aggregate, tight pour, proper curing marks. Someone had taken care with this. I felt a professional respect for whoever had set this concrete mixed with the particular sadness of good work, abandoned before it could become what it was meant to be. "We can finish this," I told Marcus. "I know we can," he said. "The question is whether the numbers work." The numbers worked, but barely. And only because Marcus structured the contract in a way that most construction firms would not have considered. Rather than taking a fixed-price contract where the builder absorbs all cost overruns, he negotiated a cost-plus arrangement with a guaranteed maximum price, meaning the client paid actual costs, plus a fixed fee, with Walker Legacy absorbing any overages above the guaranteed maximum. It was a structure that required us to know our costs with precision and manage our subcontractors without waste. It was also the structure that in the end made Riverside Commons profitable when it should have been impossible. We mobilized in November one year almost to the day, from the night I had slept behind a shelter on a county road in Haddam. I stood on the Riverside Commons site on the first morning of work and watched 12 graduates of Hayes Vocational Center climb out of 3 company trucks and pull on their tool belts. And I thought about a building on Flatbush Avenue with a broken electrical panel and 11 students and a sign that said Building Futures. Futures with the word tilted at an angle because one screw had come loose. We finished the last of the 200 units in the 3rd week of March 2024, 4 months and 2 days. The New Haven Register ran a story with a photograph of the completed development 200 homes, where the concrete graveyard had been with residents already moving in before the paint on the last unit was fully dry. Marcus handed me an envelope in the parking lot. The afternoon the final inspection was signed off. Inside was a single-page Our Project revenue summary. $47 million. I sat in the passenger seat of the company truck and held that page and thought about a Tuesday night in November and $47 on top of a bag that had been packed by someone who was done with me. The difference between $47 and $47 million is not luck. It is not talent. It is not even hard work, though. Hard work is necessary. It is the decision made in the dark and the cold by a man with nothing but a notebook and a habit of building things correctly to begin. The call came on a Tuesday morning in April from a number with a 860 area code that I did not recognize. I was in the Walker Legacy office, a proper office now, not the room above the workshop, but a suite on the 4th floor of a building on Asylum Street in downtown Hartford, with a conference table and a wall of windows that looked out over the city I had spent 45 years building from the ground up, one foundation at a time. Marcus had insisted on the office upgrade after Riverside Commons closed. He said a company with $47 million in completed project revenue had an obligation to look like it believed in itself. I had argued that the money was better spent on equipment. He had won because he was right, and I had learned by then to recognize when Marcus Reed was right before I spent too much energy being wrong. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Walker, my name is Alan Briggs. I'm a professor of construction science and technology at the University of Connecticut School of Engineering. I apologize for calling without introduction, but I've been trying to find the right way to reach you for about 6 weeks." He had the careful diction of an academic who has spent decades making complicated things accessible to people who did not come preloaded with the vocabulary. "I've been reviewing a curriculum document that was submitted to our department by a Mr. Robert Hayes. He indicated it was developed from your personal field notes. I'm hoping that's correct, because if it is, I need to speak with you as soon as possible." I sat down slowly in my chair. "That's correct," I said. "What is this about, Professor?" "Mr. Walker," he said, and I could hear him choosing his words with the care of someone who has been surprised before by how people receive unexpected good news. I've been in construction science education for 27 years. I have reviewed curriculum from programs across the country and several internationally. What you have documented in those notes, the specificity of it, the range of soil conditions and climate variables and load calculations, the joinery solutions, I have not seen anything like it in published form, anywhere. A pause. I'd like to meet with you. In person if you're willing. I think you may not fully understand what you have. We met the following Thursday at the Yukon School of Engineering in Stores, a 40-minute drive up I-84 that I made alone with the original notebook on the passenger seat in a Ziploc bag because the morning was damp and the green cover had enough years on it that I did not trust it to weather any more than it already had. Professor Briggs met me in the lobby, a compact man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the handshake of someone who had done fieldwork before he went into teaching, firm and dry and brief. He took me to his office, which had the comfortable disorder of a room where real thinking happened. Stacked journals, annotated printouts. 2 coffee cups at different stages of abandonment. He had printed sections of Robert's submission and marked them with a red pen in the dense, questioning way of a man who was not finding errors but finding things he wanted to understand more deeply. I set the original notebook on his desk. He looked at it for a moment before he touched it. The way you look at something you have been told is valuable and are still calibrating whether to believe it. Then he opened the cover and turned the first pages slowly, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when a person encounters something that reorganizes their understanding of a subject they thought they knew well. "Mr. Walker," he said without looking up, "do you understand what intellectual property rights mean in the context of a document like this?" "Tell me what you need me to understand," I said. He looked up then. "Under the United States Copyright Act, a work is protected from the moment of its creation without registration. You created this document over decades of professional practice. The knowledge in it belongs to you legally, unambiguously, completely. No institution, no publisher, no university can reproduce or distribute it without your explicit permission." He set the notebook down carefully. "What I am proposing is that the University of Connecticut license the rights to this material for use in our construction science curriculum, and that we work with a technical publisher to produce a formal edition for national distribution. The licensing fee based on comparable agreements our office has reviewed would be in the range of $2.4 million. The number sat in the room between us for a moment. "Robert Center gets the textbook free," I said. "Permanently. That's a condition." Professor Briggs did not hesitate. "We can put that in the agreement." "Then I'm interested," I said. The licensing agreement took 6 weeks to finalize, reviewed by a Hartford intellectual property attorney named Sandra Chu, who Marcus had identified through the Connecticut Bar Association's referral service. The agreement granted Yukon exclusive educational licensing rights for 15 years, with Walker retaining all commercial rights and the right to revoke upon breach. $2.4 million paid in 2 installments, half on signing, half on delivery of the annotated master document. On the afternoon I signed, I drove back to Hayes Vocational Center on Flatbush Avenue and sat in the parking lot for a while. The Building Futures sign above the door had been repaired months ago. Both mounting screws replaced the letters level. I looked at that sign and thought about a bag packed by someone who was done with me, and a green notebook at the bottom of it, and a son who had held that notebook in his hands on the morning he decided to leave his father on a county road in November, and had set it back down because he could not read what was written in it. I went inside and found Marcus at his desk, and set a copy of the signed agreement in front of him without explanation. He read the first page and then looked up with the expression of a man who has just had a piece of arithmetic confirmed that he had suspected for a long time, but had not quite trusted himself to believe. 2.4 million, he said. For the notebook, I said. The one he left in the bag. Marcus set the paper down on his desk and pressed both hands flat on it and looked out the window at Flatbush Avenue for a long moment. His jaw tight, his eyes bright with something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Mr. Walker, he said finally, his voice low and even. I want you to know that I am very glad you taught me how to build things, because right now I am feeling something that requires a very solid foundation not to collapse under. I understood exactly what he meant. I felt it too. I just had 45 more years of practice holding it upright. The television studio in Midtown Manhattan was the most aggressively air-conditioned room I had ever been in, and I have spent 45 years working in unfinished buildings in January. Marcus had driven me down from Hartford the night before, and we had stayed at a hotel on 8th Avenue that cost more per night than I had spent on groceries in a given month for most of my adult life. I had slept adequately and eaten the continental breakfast, standing at the window, watching the city do its early morning business 8 floors below, and I had put on the navy suit that our office manager, a practical woman named Carol Hendricks, had strongly suggested I purchase after Riverside Commons closed. I had resisted for 3 months. Then I had bought it. Carol had the particular gift of being right about things without needing to say so more than once. The producer who met me in the lobby was named Jesse 20-something, with the contained energy of someone managing 17 things simultaneously and making it look like 12. He walked me through the studio, explained the setup, 2 chairs, soft lighting, a camera that would be close enough that I should not look directly into it, but should look at the interviewer instead, which is something that apparently requires instruction for people who have not done this before. I had not done this before. Sandra Okafor was already in her chair when they brought me to the set. She stood when she saw me. That is the detail I remember most clearly, that she stood. She was 38 years old, with the composed alertness of someone who has spent a career in rooms where things happen and has learned to be fully present for all of them. She shook my hand with both of hers and said, "Mr. Walker, thank you for making the drive. I've been looking forward to this conversation for 3 weeks." "What happens in 3 weeks?" I asked. She smiled. "That's when I read the Riverside Commons piece in the Register and spent the rest of the afternoon canceling other things so I could start tracking you down." We sat. The lights came up. A technician clipped a small microphone to my lapel, and I resisted the instinct to look down at it, which felt like a foreign object attached to a suit I was still getting used to. Sandra opened with the practical questions: Walker legacy, the company structure, the Riverside Commons project, the curriculum, and the Yukon licensing agreement. I answered the way I answer questions on a job site, directly with enough detail to be useful and not enough to be wasteful. Then she looked up from her notes. "Mr. Walker," she said, "you founded this company at 72 years old. Walker Legacy has completed projects worth nearly $50 million in less than 2 years. You've created employment for over 60 Hartford residents, most of them from programs like Hayes Vocational Center. And you did all of this starting from essentially nothing." She paused in the way of a person who has chosen her next words carefully and is giving them room to land. "What made you start over at 72? The studio was very quiet. The kind of quiet that a room full of people produces when they have all decided at the same moment to stop moving." I looked at Sandra Okafor across the narrow space between our chairs. Behind her, through the gap in the set, I could see the edge of a monitor showing the camera feed, a 74-year-old man in a navy suit with a microphone on his lapel, sitting in a chair in Midtown Manhattan, being asked to account for his own life. I did not recognize him immediately. Then I did. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about a county road in Haddam and $47 and a green notebook at the bottom of a bag. I thought about Robert Hayes pulling over at 6 in the morning. I thought about Marcus Reed at 29 with $41,000 saved from night shifts at a distribution center sliding a folder across a desk with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided what his life is for. And then I said the thing that had been true since November of 2022, the thing I had understood completely only in the last few months, the thing that felt when I said it out loud in that air-conditioned room in Manhattan, like setting the final stone in a foundation that had taken 2 years to build. One day I realized I had not lost everything, I said. I had only lost the place I called home. And those are very different things. Sandra Okafor looked at me for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Can you say that again?" I said it again. The clip ran 48 hours later on the network's digital platform and accumulated 14 million views in the first week. The segment producer called Marcus on a Thursday to tell him the network's social team had never seen engagement numbers like it for a human interest piece. Marcus thanked her professionally and then came into my office and sat down and said, 14 million people watched you say 11 words, Mr. Walker. How does that feel?" "Loud," I said. He laughed. It was the laugh of a young man who has been through enough, that real laughter, when it comes from somewhere genuine. "Robert called," he said. "He's had 41 enrollment inquiries since Tuesday. The center's phone has not stopped." I thought about that. 41 young men and women who had seen something on a screen and decided, for whatever private reason, that they wanted to know more about a place that built things. 41 possible foundations. 41 beginnings. "Tell Robert to hire another instructor," I said. "He can take the cost from the center's share of the licensing revenue." I looked out the window at Asylum Street at the Hartford skyline I had helped build one project at a time across 4 decades. "And Marcus, the America's second chance builder thing. The press is going to want more interviews." "Almost certainly," Marcus said. "Schedule them," I said. "But not too many. We still have work to do." He was almost at the door when I said the last thing, the thing I had been sitting with since the studio in Manhattan, the thing I had not said to anyone yet, because I was still deciding whether it was true. "Marcus," I said. He stopped. I found out through a mutual contact that Michael saw the interview at a dinner party. He watched it on someone's phone and then left the table without finishing his meal. Marcus turned around slowly. His expression was careful. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. I looked at my hands on the desk. The calluses, the scar, the shadow under the nails that no soap had ever reached, and that 14 million people had now heard described as the foundation of something worth $50 million. "I feel like the next chapter is coming," I said. "Whether I'm ready or not. I have a daughter. I want to say that plainly before I tell you the rest of it, because the rest of it is complicated, and the plain fact should come first. Her name is Diane Walker. She is 40 years old, and she has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which in Eleanor was a virtue, and in me was a working tool, and in Diane had always been something I could not quite predict the direction of. She grew up in the same house as Michael, ate at the same table, heard the same things I said about honesty and integrity and the obligation a person has to stand by the people they love. She had not stood by me. I do not say that with bitterness. I have worked too hard in the past 2 years to let bitterness take up residence in any part of what I have built. Because bitterness is a foundation problem. It looks stable until you put weight on it, and then everything above it cracks. What I say it with is the particular sadness of a man who has looked at a fact long enough that he has stopped flinching at it and started simply carrying it. On the night Michael drove me 120 miles from home, Diane called him. I know this because Robert told me 6 months after I arrived at his center that he had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Diane had reached out to Michael the same week I disappeared from Hartford. What she said, according to what eventually reached Robert, was some version of Michael did what he had to do. Dad was always difficult. This will be better for everyone. She had been living in Providence, Rhode Island since 2019, a 45-minute drive from Hartford, a distance that had felt in the last years before the bus stop like something deliberately chosen. She taught middle school English. She had a partner named Greg, whose last name I did not know because she had never introduced us. She sent me a birthday card every year, the generic kind from a drugstore rack signed with her name and nothing else. No message. Just Diane. As if the signature itself was the limit of what she was willing to commit to. After the interview aired, the birthday cards stopped. The email arrived on a Wednesday evening in June, 3 weeks after the network clip had crossed 14 million views. I was at my desk on Asylum Street working through a contract proposal for a school district renovation in Bridgeport when the notification appeared on my laptop screen. The sender address was one I recognized, the same one the birthday cards had come from in electronic form over the years, the email equivalent of a drugstore signature. I opened it. The email was long. 4 paragraphs, single-spaced, the kind of length that signals a person has been composing and deleting and recomposing for a significant period of time. The first paragraph was an apology genuinely constructed, specific in places with details that told me she had thought about particular moments, rather than just the general shape of what had happened. She named the phone call to Michael. She named the birthday cards. She used the phrase, "I chose the easier thing," twice, which told me she understood something real about what she had done, because choosing the easier thing is the precise description of every act of cowardice that wears the costume of neutrality. The second paragraph was about the interview. She said she had watched it 4 times. She said that hearing me say I had only lost the place I called home had made her cry in a way she had not cried since Eleanor's funeral. She said she was proud of me, which landed in my chest with a complicated weight, the way praise from the wrong direction at the wrong time can feel like its own kind of wound. The third paragraph was about Greg and Providence and her school and the small details of a life I had not been part of for 2 years and had been only partially part of for longer than that. The fourth paragraph began, I've been going through a really difficult time financially, Dad. Greg and I are dealing with some things, and I was wondering if we might be able to sit down and talk about possibly. I stopped reading. I sat at my desk on Asylum Street, with the Hartford evening coming through the windows and my hands flat on the keyboard, and I read the first 3 words of that fourth paragraph again. I've been going through a really difficult time. I thought about Eleanor at the kitchen table in 2001, the year the construction market softened, and I worked 6 days a week for 14 months to keep the mortgage current, and never said a word about it to the children, because I did not want them carrying weight that was mine to carry. I thought about what Eleanor would have said reading this email over my shoulder. She would have said, "Tommy, she's your daughter," and I would have said, "I know." And Eleanor would have looked at me in the way she had of looking at me when she knew I already understood something and was just waiting for the courage to act on it. And she would not have said anything else because she never needed to. I typed 3 words in the reply box. I deleted them. I typed a different sentence. I deleted that. I opened a new draft and wrote a full paragraph, measured, careful, the kind of thing I would have been proud of if pride were the appropriate response to the situation. Then I read it back and understood that what I had written was a door held open at arm's length, and that a door held open at arm's length is not the same as an invitation. I closed the laptop. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the particular finality of a man who has learned in 2 years of building things from nothing that not every structure is worth the foundation it would require. Some projects you walk away from not because you cannot do the work, but because the ground will not hold. I did not reply to Diane's email. Not that night. Not the following week. Not ever. What the email did, sitting unread and unanswered in my sent folder, was clarify something I had been circling for weeks without landing on. If I stayed quiet, the story that existed in Providence and Hartford, and wherever else the Walkers had people, was the story Michael and Diane had written between them. The one where I was difficult. The one where this had been better for everyone. The one where a 72-year-old man had simply faded out of a family that had found him inconvenient. Somewhere in a house in Hartford, a 1-year-old boy named Liam was learning to walk. In another year, he would be learning to talk. In 10 years, he would be old enough to ask questions about his grandfather, and the answers he received would come from the people in the room, and the people in the room would be Michael and Jennifer and Diane. Unless someone else put a different truth in that room first. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. It was 9:47 in the evening. He answered on the second ring, because Marcus Reed answered calls at 9:47 in the evening, the same way he answered calls at 9:47 in the morning, fully without complaint. Like a man who understood that some things do not wait for business hours. "Marcus," I said, "I need you to clear my schedule for the 15th of November. A pause. "What's on the 15th? "My son is having a party," I said. "And I've decided to attend." 3 weeks before the party, Marcus walked into my office on a Thursday afternoon and closed the door behind him. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the door for a moment, with his hand still on the knob, wearing the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected for long enough that the confirmation has arrived ahead of the emotion. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair across from my desk and set a folder on the surface between us and looked at me steadily. "I need to tell you something about the Crestwood account," he said. Crestwood Property Group had been in our pipeline for 8 months. They had come to us through a commercial real estate attorney in Glastonbury who had worked with Walker Legacy on a title issue for the Riverside Commons project and had recommended us to a client looking for a construction partner on a mixed-use development in downtown Hartford. The project was substantial, a 12-story mixed-use tower on Trumbull Street, combining retail space on the ground, 2 floors with 84 residential units above, with a rooftop amenity deck and underground parking. The total construction value was $65 million. It was the largest single contract Walker Legacy had been offered, and Marcus had been the primary relationship manager through 8 months of meetings, site visits, financial disclosures, and contract negotiations. I had not attended a single meeting. That was standard practice for contracts of this size. Marcus handled the relationship until the final signing, at which point I came in as chairman to execute the agreement. It was a structure we had developed deliberately because my presence in early negotiations tended to change the dynamic in ways that were not always productive. People who had seen the interview wanted to talk about the interview, and talking about the interview was not the same as talking about load-bearing walls and project timelines. "The principal of Crestwood," Marcus said carefully. "His name is Michael Walker." I looked at Marcus across the desk. He held my gaze without flinching. "I found out this morning. The attorney who referred the account called to confirm the signing logistics for tomorrow and mentioned the client by full name. I ran the company registration." He opened the folder and turned it to face me. "Connecticut Secretary of State Business Entity Search Results, Crestwood Property Group, LLC, registered 2018 Principal Member Michael Raymond Walker address on Prospect Avenue in West Hartford. I don't know how I missed it for 8 months, Marcus said. His jaw was tight. Walker is a common name. He always went by Michael in our meetings. I never, Marcus. I stopped him. You did not miss anything. He did not tell you. Marcus pressed his lips together and nodded once, accepting that though I could see it cost him something to accept it. I looked at the business entity page. Michael Raymond Walker. The middle name was my father's. I had given it to Michael the week he was born in the maternity ward at Hartford Hospital, because my father had died the previous spring, and I wanted something of him to continue. Big Ray, the men on the job site, had called him. The man who handed me a framing hammer at 16 and told me I earned my reputation one nail at a time. I wondered if Michael had ever told anyone where his middle name came from. The signing is tomorrow at 2, Marcus said. Conference room at the attorney's office on Farmington Avenue. The contract is complete. Both sides have reviewed and approved the final language. All that remains is execution. He paused. The contract has not been signed by either party yet. We are under no legal obligation to proceed. That was the important detail. Under Connecticut contract law, a party is not bound by an agreement until the contract is executed, meaning signed by authorized representatives of both parties. 8 months of negotiations, site visits, and agreed terms created a strong expectation of performance. But expectation is not obligation. We could walk away. The professional cost would be real, the referring attorney would know, and word traveled in Hartford legal circles. But we could walk away clean. I'll be there tomorrow, I said. Marcus studied me. How do you want to handle it? The way we handle everything, I said. Correctly. The attorney's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Farmington Avenue with a view of the West Hartford Reservoir that on a clear October afternoon was almost unreasonably beautiful. The conference room had a long mahogany table and 8 chairs and a credenza along one wall with a coffee service that no one was using. The contract sat in 2 bound copies at the center of the table, one for each party with yellow signature tabs sticking up at the relevant pages like small flags planted in territory that was about to be disputed. I arrived at 1:58. Marcus was already there. The attorney, a measured man named Gerald Forsyth, who wore his experience quietly, was at the credenza. 2 representatives from the Crestwood side were already seated, a project manager and a financial officer, whose names I had been given in advance and would not use here because they had done nothing wrong and deserved no part of what was about to happen. Michael walked in at 2:01. He had his phone in his hand and was finishing a sentence to someone on the other end, the way men who are accustomed to being the most important person in a room enter rooms already speaking, establishing that their attention is valuable enough that it arrives in stages. Then he looked up and saw me standing at the far end of the conference table. The phone call ended without him saying goodbye to whoever was on the other end. He simply lowered the phone and stood in the doorway, and the color left his face in the way it leaves a room when the power goes out, not gradually, but all at once, everything just gone. I watched my son look at me from across a mahogany table with $65 million sitting between us in 2 bound copies, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. The particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a moment long enough that when it arrives, there is nothing left to be surprised by. Growled. I said without taking my eyes off Michael, "Would you mind giving Mr. Walker and me a few minutes?" Gerald Forsyth was a man who had practiced law for 31 years. He recognized the temperature of a room. He nodded at the Crestwood representatives, and they gathered their things and filed out. And Marcus followed them, and the door closed. And then it was just the two of us, and the contract, and the October light coming off the reservoir. Michael's hand was shaking. He was holding his phone against his thigh, and his hand was shaking with the fine, continuous tremor of a man whose body has understood something his mind is still catching up to. "Hello, Michael," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it. His throat moved. "Dad," he said. The word came out stripped of everything except its one bare syllable. Not a greeting, not an apology. Just the word, the way you say a word, when it is the only one you have left, and you are not sure it is enough. I picked up the folder in front of me. The contract. 2 bound copies, yellow tabs, $65 million. "We both know why I'm walking out of this room," I said. "And we both know that you know." I set the folder back down on the table without opening it. Then I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the hallway, where Marcus was waiting with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who has decided that whatever just happened, his job right now is to be steady. He fell into step beside me without a word. We rode the elevator down 14 floors in silence that was not uncomfortable, because it was the silence of two people who understand each other well enough that not everything requires language. In the lobby, I stopped at the door. "Marcus," I said. "Yes, sir." 3 weeks from today," I said. "Make sure the car is clean." The envelope arrived on a Friday morning, 11 days after I walked out of Gerald Forsyth's conference room. It was a good envelope. Heavy cardstock cream, colored the kind that costs more per box than most people spend on a meal. My name and the Asylum Street office address were printed on the front in a clean serif font not handwritten, which told me that whoever had prepared it had used a mail merge or a printing service rather than sitting at a table with a pen. The return address in the upper left corner was a house on Prospect Avenue in West Hartford that I had never been invited to visit. Carol Hendricks brought it in with the morning mail and set it on my desk without comment, because Carol had the professional discretion of someone who understood that some pieces of mail were not her business and did not require her opinion. I thanked her and waited until she had closed the door before I picked it up. Inside was an invitation. Heavy cardstock, again cream, to match the envelope, printed with the kind of clean design that costs money to look effortless. It announced in measured language a celebration of the first birthday of Liam Raymond Walker, son of Michael and Jennifer Walker, on the evening of November 15th at the Harrington Grand Hotel in downtown Hartford. Cocktail attire requested. RSVP by November 8th. Liam Raymond Walker. They had given the boy my father's name, the same name Michael carried as his middle name, Raymond, for Big Ray, who had handed me a framing hammer at 16 and told me I earned my reputation one nail at a time. I sat with that for a moment. I could not tell if it was sentiment or strategy. With Michael, the distance between those two things had always been difficult to measure. Behind the invitation, folded once, was a piece of notepaper, not printed. Handwritten in Michael's handwriting, the same compressed, left-leaning script I had watched develop from crayon drawings on refrigerator paper, to homework assignments on the kitchen table, to the signature on a business entity registration I had read 3 weeks ago in a folder Marcus had set between us. The note said, "Dad, whatever happened between us, we've put it behind us. Jennifer and I have moved past it, and we hope you have too. We've already forgiven you for the way things went. Come meet your grandson. He should know his grandfather. The 15th. We'd love to have you there." Michael, I read it twice. Then I set it on the desk and pressed it flat with both hands and read it a third time slowly, the way I read a structural drawing when something in it does not match what I know about how buildings work. We've already forgiven you. Not we're sorry. Not we were wrong. Not we have been thinking about a November night 2 years ago, and we cannot sleep, and we need you to know that we understand what we did. We've already forgiven you, as if the thing that required forgiveness was mine. As if the sequence of events, the drive, the county road, the shelter, the $47, the collect call refused in the dark. The night behind the concrete wall had been something I had done to them rather than something they had done to me. I thought about the collect call, my own voice on the operator's line asking to be connected. My son's voice on the other end, that same compressed left-leaning voice saying no. She has to learn. I thought about a woman sitting in a car 20 minutes from a bus shelter at 2 in the morning, with the engine running and the lights on, looking at the dark and choosing the road home. I thought about Liam Raymond Walker, 1 year old, named for a man his grandfather had loved, growing up in a house on Prospect Avenue, where the story of his grandfather would be told by the people who had written the version that did not include a county road or a shelter or $47. Unless someone changed that. I opened my laptop and navigated to the RSVP link printed at the bottom of the invitation. The form was simple name, number of guests, dietary restrictions. I filled in Thomas Walker, 2 guests, myself and Marcus, who would be driving. No dietary restrictions. I moved the cursor to the submit button and held it there for a moment. Then I clicked. That evening I called my attorney, a Hartford estate planning lawyer named William Okafor, no relation to Sandra, who had handled Walker Legacy's corporate documents since our 2nd year of operation. I told him I wanted to establish an irrevocable trust for a minor beneficiary. An irrevocable trust, I explained to myself as much as to him, is a legal arrangement under which assets are transferred to a trustee to be managed for the benefit of a named beneficiary, with the critical feature that the person establishing the trust, the grantor, cannot dissolve or modify it after execution. The assets in the trust are legally separated from the grantor's estate, and importantly, from the legal reach of the beneficiary's parents, who have no authority over a properly structured irrevocable trust established by a third party. $5 million in Liam Raymond Walker's name. Accessible at age 25 for education or business formation, with a provision for earlier access in cases of documented medical necessity. William drafted the document over the weekend, and I reviewed it on Monday and signed it on Tuesday morning with Carol and Marcus as witnesses. Marcus looked at the trust document for a long time after I signed it. Then he looked at me. "This is not about the party," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said. "The party is one evening. This is 25 years. He nodded slowly. "And Michael cannot touch it." "Michael has no legal standing in relation to this trust," I said. "It is between me and Liam. His parents are not parties to it in any capacity." I capped the pen and set it on the desk. That is the point. The night before the party, I sat at my kitchen table with the notepaper from Michael's envelope in front of me and Eleanor's photograph propped against the coffee maker. The way I always kept it, because the kitchen was where she had been most herself, and I wanted her most herself in the room where I did my thinking. "We've already forgiven you." I looked at Eleanor's photograph for a long time. She was laughing in it, a candid shot from a 4th of July cookout in 1998, her head turned slightly to the left. Mid-laugh, her eyes bright with whatever someone had just said. She had not known the camera was there. That was why it was the best photograph anyone had ever taken of her. Because she had not been performing. "I'm going tomorrow," I told her. "Not for Michael, not for Jennifer. For a 1-year-old boy named after your father-in-law, who deserves to know that the story his family is going to tell him is not the only story there is." The coffee maker light blinked once and went still. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and smelled like the candle Carol had given me for Christmas last year, cedar and something softer underneath. I folded Michael's note and put it in the envelope, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of the navy suit jacket hanging on the back of the bedroom door. Then I went to bed. In the morning, Marcus picked me up at 6:30 in a car that was, as requested, very clean. The Harrington Grand sits on Trumbull Street in downtown Hartford, 12 stories of limestone and glass that I had walked past several hundred times over 45 years without ever going inside. Marcus pulled the car to the front entrance at 7:14 in the evening. It was a black Lincoln Navigator, clean as promised, and the valet who opened my door was a young man who could not have been more than 22, wearing a red jacket and the practiced neutrality of someone who has been trained to treat every arriving guest with identical deference, regardless of what they arrive in. I stepped out onto the pavement and straightened my jacket, the navy suit, Carol's recommendation, the one that had been to Manhattan and back and had held its shape through both, and looked up at the hotel entrance. 2 years, 1 month, and 1 day since a county road in Haddam. Marcus came around from the driver's side and fell into step beside me. He was wearing a charcoal suit of his own, no tie, and he moved through the entrance with the particular ease of a man who has learned that confidence is not about what you wear, but about being entirely clear on why you are somewhere. Behind us, 2 of Walker Legacy's senior partners, James Whitfield, no relation to Pastor Jean, and a woman named Ruth Brennan, who had joined us after Riverside Commons, followed at a professional distance. The lobby of the Harrington Grand was warm and high-ceilinged, with the kind of lighting that costs a great deal of money to make look effortless. A hotel staff member in a dark blazer directed us to the elevator for the 18th floor, where the Harrington Ballroom had been reserved for the Walker party. I noticed as the elevator doors opened on 18 that someone had arranged cream-colored balloons in clusters near the entrance, and that a sign on an easel read, "Welcome Liam, 1 year of wonder," in gold lettering on cream cardstock that matched the invitation. The ballroom held approximately 200 people when we arrived, and from the density of the room and the noise level, perhaps 160 of them were already present. Round tables with cream linens and low floral centerpieces. A bar along the far wall doing steady business. A small stage at the front of the room where a microphone stand suggested that speeches were expected. In the center of the back wall, a large framed photograph of Liam Raymond Walker at various stages of his first year, newborn, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, arranged in a grid with a script font that read, "Our Greatest Adventure." I stood at the entrance to the ballroom and took the room in the way I take in any new structure systematically, without rushing, looking for what holds and what does not. Jennifer saw me first. She was standing near the bar with 2 women I did not recognize, wearing a dress the color of champagne, and she turned toward the entrance with the automatic social radar of a person who has hosted enough events that they track arrivals the way an air traffic controller tracks approaches. When her eyes found me, they stopped. The glass in her hand went very still. Then something moved through her expression, too fast and too complicated to name, and she looked away, and I watched her say something quietly to the woman beside her without looking at me again. Then Dot Callahan found me. Dorothy Callahan had lived 3 houses down from us on Arbor Street for 22 years. She was 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher who grew the best tomatoes in the neighborhood, and had brought a casserole to my door every week for the first month after Eleanor died, without ever asking if I wanted one. She was standing near the entrance with a glass of white wine, wearing a blue dress that I suspected was the same blue dress she had worn to Eleanor's funeral, and when she saw me, she went completely still for a moment. Then her face did something I was not prepared for. It crumpled at the edges, the particular crumpling of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Her eyes went bright and wet, and she pressed her lips together hard and crossed the room to me with the deliberate speed of a woman who is not going to let distance stop her from doing what she has decided to do. She took both my hands in hers. Her grip was firm and warm and shaking slightly at the edges. "Thomas Walker," she said, and her voice broke on my name in a way that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "I have been waiting 2 years to do this." I said. "You look well." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and squeezed my hands harder. "Don't you dare be dignified at me right now," she said. "I know what happened. Robert Hayes told me 6 months ago. I have thought about you every single day." I covered her hands with mine and held them for a moment. "I know," I said. "Thank you for the casseroles you left at Robert's center. He told me who sent them." She pressed her lips together again and nodded, and stepped back, and composed herself with the efficient grace of a woman who has been composing herself in public for 68 years and has gotten very good at it. "You go do what you came to do," she said. Her voice was steady now. "I'll be right here." I had been in the room approximately 4 minutes when Michael appeared. He came from the direction of the bar, moving with the trajectory of a man who has spotted something he needs to manage before it manages itself. He was in a dark suit, well cut, and he had his party expression on the one I had seen at dinners and charity events, smooth and warm and calibrated to the room. It dropped by about 30% when he got close enough to see my face clearly. "Dad." He stopped 2 feet from me. His voice was the same compressed syllable it had been in the conference room 3 weeks ago. But this time, it had more layers in it, surprise calculation, and underneath both of those, something raw that I chose to believe was genuine. "You came. You invited me," I said. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, his palm dry. The grip of a man maintaining control through effort rather than ease. "Congratulations on Liam. He has your mother's name on one side and my father's on the other. That's a good foundation for a boy." Michael looked at me for a moment, with an expression I could not fully read. "I'm glad you're here," he said. I noted that he said it without specifying why, which told me something about the distance between what he had intended by the invitation and what he was now calculating it had produced. Sandra Okafor was at a table near the stage with 2 colleagues I recognized from the network and a small digital recorder on the table beside her water glass. She caught my eye across the room and gave the smallest possible nod, the professional acknowledgement of 2 people who know each other and understand that this is not the moment for conversation. The recorder's indicator light was dark. She was not recording yet. I took my seat at the head table and accepted a glass of water from a server and looked out at 200 people in a ballroom on the 18th floor of a Hartford hotel gathered to celebrate a 1-year-old boy who was at this moment presumably asleep somewhere nearby, unaware that his grandfather had just sat down in a room that was about to change the story he would grow up hearing. Michael took the microphone at 7:45. His voice filled the ballroom with the practiced ease of a man who has spoken in rooms like this before. He thanked the Harrington Grand. He thanked their guests. He said that tonight was about family, about everything a family builds together and everything it passes down. He looked down the head table at me when he said that last part. I looked back at him steadily and picked up my water glass and held it and waited for the moment I had driven 120 miles in a clean car to arrive. Before I reveal the shocking truth behind that unforgettable night type 1 in the comments below, so I know you're still watching with me. And please note the story moving forward includes some fictional details crafted for dramatic effect. If this isn't the type of content you enjoy, you are completely free to turn off the video right now. Michael finished his remarks at 7:53, and handed the microphone back with the satisfied ease of a man who believes the room belongs to him. He was not wrong. The room did belong to him, the flowers, the linens, the 200 people who had come on his invitation. He had built this evening the way he built everything, with careful attention to appearances and a thorough understanding of what other people wanted to see. I stood up. The movement was not dramatic. I simply stood the way a man stands when he has something to say and has decided that the time for not saying it is finished. Marcus went very still. Callahan straightened in her chair. The event coordinator extended the microphone toward me. I took it. "My name is Thomas Walker," I said. My voice came out the way it comes out on a job site, not loud, but clear with enough foundation under it that it carries. Most of you know me as Liam's grandfather. I'd like to say a few words. 200 people rearranged their attention. The bar stopped doing business. Forks were set down. 45 years ago, I learned to lay a foundation from a man who told me that everything built above the ground is only as honest as the ground it sits on. Tonight, I want to honor that principle. So I'm going to tell you something true. 2 years ago, on the 14th of November, my son Michael drove me 120 miles from my home in Hartford. He told me we were taking a drive together. We drove for 2 hours. Then he stopped at an abandoned bus shelter on a county road outside Haddam, Connecticut. He left me $47. Before he drove away, he told me I was a burden. That word burden is the last thing my son said to me before his taillights disappeared around a bend in a county road. I was 72 years old. I had no phone, no identification, no way home. And I slept that night behind a trash can on a county road in Connecticut on a piece of cardboard in 26-degree weather. In the morning, I walked 2 miles east until a man named Robert Hayes, a man I had taught to set a foundation 30 years before, recognized me and took me in. Shouts, I am not telling you this to cause pain. I am telling you this because in this room tonight, there is a 1-year-old boy named Liam Raymond Walker who is going to grow up and ask questions about his family. I want to make sure that at least one person in his life has said the true version out loud in front of witnesses before it gets replaced by a more comfortable one. Jennifer's champagne glass came down on the table with a sound like a small crack. My son's invitation told me that he and Jennifer had already forgiven me. Forgiveness is extended by the person who has been wronged to the person who did the wrong. I was left at a bus shelter at 72 years old with $47. I was not the one who needed forgiving. Michael stood up. His chair went back hard. His face was the color of the limestone facade outside his hands in fists at his sides. Dad. His voice cracked down the middle. That is enough. I looked at my son with 200 people watching him and felt the weight of a man who loves his child and is no longer willing to let that love be used as a reason to stay quiet. Michael, I said level and low without anger. I am almost finished. There is one more thing this room needs to know. It concerns a car that sat on a county road in the dark for 20 minutes. Sit down, because what comes next is not about you. I turned and looked at Jennifer. Both hands on the table, knuckles white against the cream linen, her face working very hard to be something other than what it was. Pastor Whitfield is in this room tonight, I said. I invited him, and he has something he has been waiting 2 years to say. Pastor Eugene Whitfield stood up from a table near the back of the ballroom. He stood with the unhurried dignity of a man who has delivered difficult truths from a pulpit for 30 years. The room turned toward him in a wave, table by table, face by face, until 200 people were watching a 62-year-old pastor in a worn blazer standing in a Hartford ballroom on a November evening. He did not reach for a microphone. His voice carried without one. My name is Eugene Whitfield. I am the pastor of Shepherd's Crossing Community Church in Middletown, Connecticut. Thomas Walker rebuilt my church's foundation last year free of charge. I am here as his guest. And I need to say something I have been carrying for 2 years. Jennifer's hands came off the table. She took one step back from her chair, suspended in the paralysis of a person who has understood that the ground beneath them is not what they believed. On the night of November 14th, 2 years ago, I was awake in my sanctuary. Around 2 in the morning, I looked out the east window facing the county road. There was a vehicle moving very slowly, much slower than the road required. It came from the west, from the direction of Hartford, and rolled past the bus shelter like a driver looking for something, rather than going somewhere. Michael sat down. Not deliberately. His legs simply stopped holding him. The vehicle sat approximately 50 meters from the shelter for 20 minutes. Engine running. Lights on. Then it drove east, back toward Hartford. Pastor Gene's voice went quiet. There was a person in the passenger seat, a woman. She was turned toward the shelter the entire time, looking hard. The way a person looks at something they came a long way to see. Jennifer made a sound, not a word, just air escaping a sealed room through a gap she had not intended to leave open. Her hands covered her mouth. Her shoulders heaved. The tears came freely and she made no move to stop them. These were not the managed tears I had watched her deploy at social occasions for years. These were the other kind. The kind that arrive when there is nothing left to manage. Pastor Gene looked at Jennifer directly. Not with anger, with sadness. You came back that night, he said gently. I want you to know I prayed for you both. The person in the shelter and the person in the car. Marcus picked up his glass. To the foundation, he said quietly. I raised mine last. To Liam. May he always know the difference between a foundation and a facade. Michael said 4 words. Not an apology, not an explanation. He looked at me across the head table with that expression I had never seen before. Stripped of calculation, stripped of performance, stripped of everything his adult life had layered over whatever was underneath. And he said, everything he said is true. Then he sat down. The room absorbed it. 200 people absorbing 4 words that had just confirmed everything, denied nothing, and left no version standing except the one I had given them. I stood. I reached into my jacket and set the trust document envelope on the table in front of Michael. $5 million, I said quietly. In Liam's name. Irrevocable. He gets it at 25. It has nothing to do with you. Michael looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. I walked out of the ballroom. In the corridor outside, a hotel attendant was pushing a stroller toward the service elevator. Inside it, sleeping with the absolute confidence of someone who has never had a reason not to, was Liam Raymond Walker. 1-year-old. His grandfather's name on one side, his great-grandfather's on the other. I stopped. I crouched down beside the stroller and looked at my grandson's face for the first time. He had Eleanor's mouth. He had my hands already, even at 1 year, the wide, flat palms and the square fingers of someone built to hold things. I put one hand on the edge of the stroller. I did not wake him. Hey, Liam, I said softly. I'm your grandfather. I just wanted you to know I was here. Marcus appeared beside me. I stood. We walked to the elevator without speaking. In the lobby, Michael caught up. Dad. His voice was stripped bare. How did you do it? I looked at my son. I picked up what you left behind, I said, and I built something with it. I walked out into the Hartford night. I have told you this family story not to settle scores, but to set the record straight for a boy named Liam, who deserves to know what his grandfather's hands were actually worth. If these grandpa stories have taught me anything, it is this: the moment you allow shame to decide who belongs at your table, you have already lost the most important thing a family story can pass down: dignity. I lost 2 years. Do not lose yours waiting for an apology that was never coming. I am not a perfect man. I made mistakes as a father that I carry quietly. But I know this: when God closes one door and someone you loved bolts it from the inside, He has a habit of leaving a window open somewhere down the road. Robert Hayes was my window. Marcus Reed was my window. A green notebook at the bottom of a trash bag was my window. These grandpa stories belong to all of us who were ever told we were too old, too worn, too inconvenient to matter. We are not finished. We are just getting started. If this family story moved something in, you drop a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that truth is worth building on, subscribe to this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements crafted purely to inspire, if that is not your preference. Feel free to explore other content that better suits you. But I hope you stay,